The moment I saw my cabin door swinging open in the security footage, I knew someone had taken the bait. For weeks, I'd waited patiently, watching as Victoria Jenkins, the self-appointed queen of Pine Lake Estates Homeowners Association, had escalated her campaign of harassment against my family property. What she didn't know was that I'd prepared for this exact moment. Every creaking floorboard, every malfunctioning appliance, and every coincidental power outage had been meticulously engineered for her special visit. The security camera captured her triumphant smirk as she strode inside with her designer heels, clicking against my grandfather's hand-laid hardwood floors. She had no idea she was walking into a perfectly legal trap, 5 months in the making. My story begins like many others, with inheritance and nostalgia. 6 months ago, my grandfather Robert passed away at 92, leaving me his treasured lakeside cabin that had been in our family for over 70 years. The modest 2-bedroom structure sat on 3 acres of pristine waterfront, built by my grandfather's own hands after returning from World War II. Every summer of my childhood was spent there, learning to fish, swimming in the crystal-clear waters, and listening to Grandpa's stories by the fire. The cabin wasn't fancy. Its cedar siding had weathered to a distinguished silver gray, and the stone fireplace had been constructed with rocks my grandfather had collected from the property. But it was perfect, filled with generations of memories and craftsmanship you couldn't replicate with modern construction. When I arrived to claim my inheritance, I discovered Pine Lake had changed dramatically. What had once been a collection of modest family cabins scattered around the shoreline had transformed into an upscale community of vacation homes with manicured lawns and coordinated color schemes. At the center of this transformation was Victoria Jenkins, a former real estate developer from Chicago who'd moved to Pine Lake 5 years ago and quickly established herself as HOA president through a combination of intimidation and procedural manipulation. Our first encounter occurred 3 days after I'd arrived to assess the cabin's condition. I was clearing some overgrown brush when a black Range Rover pulled into my gravel driveway. Victoria emerged, wearing white linen pants, a silk blouse, and enough jewelry to sink a small boat. Her platinum blonde hair was pulled into a tight bun that seemed to stretch her face into a permanent look of disapproval. "You must be Robert Anderson's grandson," she said, not bothering to introduce herself as she surveyed my property with thinly disguised contempt. "I am Victoria Jenkins, president of Pine Lake Estates Homeowners Association. I've been trying to reach you about several compliance issues with this property." I wiped my hands on my jeans and extended one in greeting. "James Anderson, nice to meet you." I wasn't aware my grandfather's property was part of any association. Victoria's smile tightened. "Pine Lake Estates incorporated all lakefront properties last year through a special town council resolution. Your grandfather was notified, of course, but given his condition, we didn't expect full compliance immediately." She handed me a thick binder embossed with Pine Lake Estates HOA guidelines and regulations. "You'll find all the necessary information inside. I've taken the liberty of tagging the most urgent violations." Her perfectly manicured finger pointed to colored tabs protruding from the binder. "The exterior siding needs to be replaced with approved materials. That boat dock doesn't meet current specifications. And of course, all that natural vegetation will need to be replaced with approved landscaping." I leafed through the binder, noting with growing alarm the extensive violations and their associated fines. This would cost tens of thousands of dollars. I'm not sure my grandfather would have agreed to these changes to his property. Victoria's smile never reached her eyes. "The town council vote was unanimous, Mr. Anderson. All properties must comply within 90 days or face daily fines. I understand this is a difficult time for you, but rules are rules. Pine Lake Estates has standards to maintain. Property values. You understand." As she turned to leave, she paused. "Oh, and we've scheduled the next HOA meeting for Friday evening. Your attendance is mandatory as a new member." With that, she slid back into her Range Rover and departed, leaving a cloud of dust and disbelief in her wake. That evening, I called my cousin Sarah, who worked as a property attorney in the nearest city. "This doesn't sound right," she said after I explained the situation. Check the county records office. If Grandpa's property was incorporated into an HOA, there would be documentation he signed. Without his consent, they can't just absorb his private property. The next morning, I drove to the county offices and spent hours poring over property records. What I discovered confirmed my suspicions. My grandfather's parcel had been specifically excluded from the HOA incorporation due to its historical status. There was even a notation about my grandfather's refusal to join, citing the property's heritage designation. Victoria had lied, betting that I wouldn't check the records or challenge her authority. I also discovered something far more interesting. The original survey maps showed that a small but significant portion of what was now the HOA's clubhouse and marina had been built partially on land that still belonged to my grandfather's estate. It seemed Victoria's predecessor had quietly encroached on our property during construction, assuming my aging grandfather wouldn't notice or complain. Armed with this knowledge, I attended Friday's HOA meeting where Victoria presided like a queen holding court. About 30 homeowners filled the clubhouse's meeting room, most looking either bored or intimidated. Victoria stood at the podium in a designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly salary, flanked by her executive committee, Walter Simmons, a retired banker who served as treasurer, and Margaret Chen, a timid woman who barely spoke but dutifully recorded minutes as secretary. Before we begin our regular agenda, Victoria announced, "I'd like to introduce our newest member, James Anderson, who has inherited the Anderson property on the North Shore." All eyes turned to me. "We're expecting full compliance with our regulations within 90 days. Isn't that right, Mr. Anderson?" I stood, feeling the weight of everyone's attention. "Actually, I've been reviewing the property records, and it seems there's been a misunderstanding. My grandfather's property was specifically excluded from the HOA's incorporation last year. I have the documentation right here." I held up the folder containing the county records. Victoria's smile froze. "That's impossible." The town council vote was unanimous. "For properties that consented," I continued. "Yes, but my grandfather's parcel received a historical designation exemption." I approached the podium and placed the documents on the table. "These are the official records showing the exclusion." Victoria barely glanced at them. "These must be outdated. I'll have our attorney review them. Until then, we'll proceed as planned with the compliance schedule." An older man in the back row raised his hand. "Could we see those documents? If there's an exemption, might affect other properties too." Victoria's voice sharpened. "Harold, we're following the agenda. The board will review any documentation privately and make an appropriate determination." She shuffled her papers. Moving on to new business. The meeting continued, but I noticed several homeowners watching me with newfound interest. As we broke for refreshments afterward, a few approached me discreetly. Harold Mackenzie, the man who had spoken up, shook my hand firmly. "Your grandfather was a good man. Lived by his principles. These HOA vultures have been picking at his property for years, waiting for him to give in, or—" He didn't finish the sentence. "I'm glad you're standing your ground." A middle-aged couple introduced themselves as the Patels. "Victoria threatened to fine us for our garden last month," Mrs. Patel whispered. "Said our vegetables were unsightly and reduced property values. We had to remove them." Over the next hour, I heard similar stories from at least 6 different homeowners. Excessive fines for minor infractions, selective enforcement of rules, and a pattern of pushing out long-time residents to make way for luxury developments. Most troubling were the whispers about Victoria's connections with a development company called Lakeview Properties, a company she reportedly still held significant shares in despite claiming to have divested when she became HOA president. As I was leaving, Victoria intercepted me in the parking lot. All pretense of courtesy had vanished from her voice. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but this community has standards. That eyesore of a cabin either comes into compliance or you'll regret it." Her perfect veneers flashed in what might generously be called a smile. Things happen to properties around here. Vandalism, break-ins. It's so unfortunate, especially to vacant buildings. The threat couldn't have been clearer if she'd written it on her business card. Over the next few weeks, Victoria's intimidation campaign intensified. Citations for violations appeared on my door daily: excessive vegetation, unapproved exterior color, non-compliant dock structure. Each came with increasingly steep fines. When I removed them, new ones appeared the next day. My security cameras caught Victoria herself placing them, always during daylight hours when most residents were at work or away from their vacation homes. Then came the escalation. First, someone reported my abandoned vehicle to the county, resulting in my truck nearly being towed despite being legally parked on my own property. Next, my boat mysteriously came untethered during a storm, drifting halfway across the lake before I could recover it. Finally, the water to my cabin was shut off for emergency maintenance that somehow only affected my property. Throughout it all, I carefully documented everything, every interaction with Victoria, every false citation, every suspicious incident. But I also began to formulate a plan, one that would require patience, careful preparation, and intimate knowledge of both property law and human psychology. During my childhood summers, my grandfather had taught me about the cabin's quirks and history, how certain floorboards would creak unless you knew exactly where to step, how the old plumbing would shudder and groan if you didn't open the valves in the correct sequence, the antique electrical panel with its peculiar labeling system that made sense only to those familiar with its idiosyncrasies. What most would see as the annoying characteristics of an aging structure, I recognized as a perfect foundation for my strategy. I began my preparations methodically. First, I installed a comprehensive security system with cameras covering every angle of the property, all feeding to cloud storage and my smartphone. Next, I consulted my cousin Sarah about the legal implications of what I was planning. As long as you're not creating dangerous conditions intended to cause harm, you're on solid legal ground, she assured me. It's your property, and you have no obligation to make it convenient for trespassers. With Sarah's legal advice guiding my approach, I set to work creating what I called inconvenience traps throughout the cabin. None were dangerous or illegal, just deeply frustrating for anyone unfamiliar with the property's peculiarities. I disconnected the hot water heater power connection but left the breaker switch on, creating the illusion of a functioning system that would deliver only ice-cold showers. I installed motion-sensitive lights that would suddenly shut off after exactly 47 seconds of detecting no movement, just long enough for someone to get comfortable before being plunged into darkness. The toilet was rigged to run continuously unless the handle was jiggled in a specific pattern, and the kitchen sink would drip incessantly despite appearing to be tightly shut off. For the piece de resistance, I installed a custom programmable thermostat that would make the cabin alternately too hot or too cold at unpredictable intervals. All of these malfunctions could be remotely monitored and controlled through my phone, allowing me to adjust the intensity based on who was inside. With the physical preparations complete, I moved to the next phase of my plan, the social groundwork. I began attending town council meetings, introducing myself as Robert Anderson's grandson, and quietly building relationships with local officials. I joined the Historical Society and donated some of my grandfather's photographs and journals documenting the lake's early development. Through these activities, I established myself as a respectful, community-minded property owner interested in preserving Pine Lake's heritage. I also began hosting small gatherings at the cabin, inviting neighbors who had shared their HOA horror stories. We grilled on the deck, shared drinks, and swapped tales of Victoria's reign of terror. Harold Mackenzie brought his collection of historical maps, showing the original property lines, confirming my discovery about the clubhouse encroachment. The Patels shared documents showing how their fines had mysteriously increased after they questioned Victoria's connection to Lakeview properties. Bit by bit, we assembled a comprehensive picture of Victoria's manipulations and conflicts of interest. During one such gathering, Harold pulled me aside. "You should know that Victoria's been asking questions about you in town, checking your background, looking for leverage," his weathered face creased with concern. "She's also been seen taking photographs of your property when you're away. Be careful, son." She doesn't play fair. I'm counting on that, Harold, I replied, watching the sunset reflect off the lake's surface. In fact, I'm planning for it. The following Monday, I made a show of packing my truck and informing several neighbors that I needed to return to the city for work. I'll be gone at least 2 weeks, I told Mrs. Patel loudly as I loaded my suitcase. Would you mind collecting my mail? I made sure to leave the cabin looking lived in but secured, with a few lights on timers and the security system ostensibly armed. What Victoria didn't know was that I was actually staying at Harold's guest house just 2 miles away, with a perfect view of my security feeds on my laptop. Based on the pattern of escalation, I estimated it would take 3 to 5 days before Victoria made her move. It took only 2. On Wednesday evening, my phone alerted me to motion at the cabin's front door. The security feed showed Victoria approaching with Walter Simmons, the HOA treasurer. She tried the door, finding it locked, then produced a key from her purse. I sat up straighter. Where had she gotten a key? The answer came moments later when Walter said something about, the locksmith did good work, confirming my suspicion that they had commissioned an unauthorized key. Victoria entered first, Walter following nervously. Are you sure we should be doing this? He asked, his voice perfectly captured by my hidden microphones. Relax, Walter, Victoria replied, her tone dripping with self-assurance as she flipped on the lights and began examining the living room. We're conducting an official HOA inspection after receiving complaints about potential code violations. It's all in the bylaws. She paused, then added, besides, he's gone for 2 weeks. No one will know we were here. I smiled as I watched them tour my home without permission. Every intrusive step, every dismissive comment about my grandfather's furnishings, every cabinet they opened was being recorded in high definition. But the real show was just beginning. About 10 minutes into their uninvited tour, the living room lights suddenly went out, plunging them into darkness save for the fading evening light through the windows. Walter yelped in surprise. Oh, for heaven's sake, Victoria muttered, pulling out her phone's flashlight. Probably those ancient wiring. Where's the breaker panel? They fumbled their way to the kitchen where Victoria located the electrical panel and reset the breaker. The lights came back on. Let's hurry up, Walter said nervously. I don't like this. They continued their inspection, making notes about violations on a clipboard. Victoria was particularly contemptuous of my grandfather's handmade furniture. All of this will have to go, she declared. It's a fire hazard and an eyesore. When they reached the bathroom, the next trap triggered. Victoria turned on the shower to check the water pressure, and a burst of ice-cold water shot out. She jumped back, partially soaking her silk blouse. What the hell? She exclaimed, trying the hot water handle again. Nothing but cold water emerged. Maybe the water heater's broken, Walter suggested. Victoria scowled. This entire place is a disaster. We should condemn it as uninhabitable. She made another note on her clipboard. As they continued their unauthorized inspection, more malfunctions occurred. The thermostat kicked in, rapidly heating the cabin to uncomfortable levels. When Victoria attempted to adjust it, the system appeared to break, the digital display going blank. Minutes later, as they were examining my grandfather's study, the toilet began running continuously from their earlier use, creating an irritating background noise that grew increasingly distracting. This is ridiculous, Victoria said, returning to the bathroom to jiggle the handle unsuccessfully. How does anyone live like this? By now, they had spent over 40 minutes in my cabin, providing me with extensive documentation of their trespassing and unauthorized inspection. But the coup de grace was yet to come. As Victoria led Walter to the kitchen to examine what she called my non-compliant vintage appliances, she opened the refrigerator, triggering a silent alarm I'd installed that caused all exterior doors to automatically lock with an audible click. Walter spun around. What was that? Victoria rolled her eyes. Probably just the house settling. This place is falling apart. She continued making notes, unaware that they were now temporarily confined within the cabin. It was only when they tried to leave 15 minutes later that they discovered their predicament. Victoria yanked on the front door, finding it immovable. "It's stuck," she said, pulling harder. Walter tried his weight against it, then attempted the back door with the same result. "They're both locked somehow." "That's impossible." "We didn't lock them." Victoria's composure was finally cracking. She pulled out her phone. "I'm calling Frank. He can bring tools." That's when the final element of my plan activated. The cellular signal jammer, legally purchased for privacy protection, kicked in, blocking all calls from inside the cabin. Victoria stared at her phone in disbelief as "no service" flashed on her screen. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, her perfectly controlled facade crumbling. "Try the windows." All windows on the first floor had been secured with child safety locks, not enough to prevent escape in a genuine emergency, but sufficient to require noticeable force and potentially damage Victoria's designer outfit. As I watched them grow increasingly frantic, I decided they'd had enough. I remotely deactivated the door locks, timing it perfectly with Victoria's next attempt to force the front door open. The sudden release sent her stumbling backward into Walter, both of them tumbling onto the porch in an undignified heap. Just as Harold Mackenzie happened to be driving by with his fishing boat in tow. Harold slowed, then stopped completely, observing the strange scene of the HOA president and treasurer scrambling to their feet outside a cabin whose owner was supposedly away. "Evening, Victoria," he called. "Didn't expect to see you at the Anderson place. Is James back early?" Victoria smoothed her rumpled clothing, her face flushed with a combination of exertion and embarrassment. "Official HOA inspection, Harold." "Nothing that concerns you." Harold nodded slowly. "Interesting. Don't recall seeing any inspection notices posted. And I'm pretty sure James would need to be present or give permission for anyone to enter his property." He pulled out his phone and appeared to take a photo before continuing toward the lake. Victoria and Walter retreated hastily to her Range Rover, their inspection cut dramatically short. As they pulled away, I couldn't help but smile at the thought of Victoria trying to explain her disheveled appearance and unauthorized presence to the notoriously gossipy Harold. The next morning, I returned to my cabin, making a show of arriving with grocery bags as if I'd just returned from my trip. Within an hour, Harold appeared at my door with a knowing smile. "Interesting visitors you had yesterday," he said, accepting the coffee I offered. Victoria and Walter seemed quite flustered when they left. I maintained an expression of innocent confusion. "Visitors?" "I was out of town." Harold's eyes twinkled. "That's what I thought. Funny thing, Victoria was telling everyone at the coffee shop this morning about how your cabin is a death trap. Faulty wiring, plumbing issues, malfunctioning heat. Says it's uninhabitable and dangerous." "Is that so?" I sipped my coffee. Interesting that she'd know such details about my private property. "Indeed," Harold said, setting down his mug. "Community council meeting tonight. Might be worth attending." That evening, I arrived at the town hall to find it unusually crowded. Word had spread about Victoria's unauthorized visit to my property, and both year-round residents and seasonal homeowners had turned out in unprecedented numbers. Victoria sat at the council table, her composure restored, but her eyes widening slightly when she saw me enter. The meeting proceeded through routine matters until the council president, Bill Harkins, reached new business. Victoria immediately stood, smoothing her immaculate pantsuit. "I'd like to address a serious safety concern," she began, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "The Anderson property on North Shore Drive represents a significant hazard to our community. During a routine exterior inspection, we observed multiple code violations, including faulty electrical systems, plumbing issues, and structural concerns." Before she could continue, I raised my hand. "Excuse me, Mr. President, but I'd like to respond to these allegations about my property." Bill nodded. "Of course, Mr. Anderson." I approached the podium carrying a folder of documents and my tablet. "Miss Jenkins has made serious claims about my property's condition, which is surprising since I've never authorized or been present for any inspection, interior or exterior." I paused, letting the implications sink in. "However, I am deeply concerned about unauthorized entry to my property while I was away." Victoria's face tightened. "As HOA president, I have the authority to conduct inspections when there are safety concerns." "That would be true, Miss Jenkins," I replied calmly, "if my property were part of your HOA. As I have previously documented, it is not." I distributed copies of the county records to council members. "Furthermore, I have evidence that you and Mr. Simmons entered my home without permission while I was allegedly away." The room grew quiet as I connected my tablet to the projector. The security footage played clearly, showing Victoria using an unauthorized key to enter my cabin, followed by her and Walter's increasingly flustered exploration of my home and their undignified exit. When the video ended, I continued calmly. "This is a clear case of breaking and entering, potentially burglary depending on intent, and definitely trespassing. I've already filed a police report." I nodded toward the back of the room where Officer Peterson stood, having arrived during the video presentation. Victoria's composure finally shattered completely. "This is absurd. We were conducting a legitimate inspection after receiving complaints. The Anderson property is a disgrace to Pine Lake and is driving down property values for all of us." I maintained my calm demeanor. "Miss Jenkins, property values seem to be a particular concern of yours. Perhaps that's connected to your continued financial interest in Lakeview Properties, which has been attempting to acquire lakefront parcels for a new development." I distributed another set of documents showing Victoria's ownership stake in the development company. A murmur swept through the room as homeowners examined the evidence of Victoria's conflict of interest. Walter Simmons looked particularly pale, edging away from Victoria as if to dissociate himself from what was unfolding. "While investigating Miss Jenkins' unauthorized entry to my property," I continued, "I also discovered something else of interest to this council. I projected the original survey maps. A portion of the HOA clubhouse and marina was actually constructed on land still legally owned by my family. It appears the developer, Lakeview Properties, exceeded the boundaries of their purchased parcel during construction." The council chambers erupted in conversation as this revelation sank in. Victoria attempted to speak over the noise, her voice rising to a shrill pitch that only undermined her rapidly diminishing authority. Bill Harkins eventually restored order with his gavel. "These are serious allegations that require investigation. Miss Jenkins, do you wish to respond to the evidence Mr. Anderson has presented?" Victoria's response was a desperate attempt to reassert control. "This is obviously a manipulated video designed to damage my reputation. The Anderson property has been a community eyesore for years, and now he's trying to distract from that fact with these baseless accusations." Officer Peterson stepped forward. "Ma'am, breaking and entering is a serious offense. We'll need you and Mr. Simmons to come to the station to provide statements." What followed was a community reckoning unlike anything Pine Lake had seen in generations. Victoria and Walter were escorted from the meeting by Officer Peterson, Victoria protesting loudly while Walter appeared resigned to his fate. The council voted unanimously to conduct an independent audit of the HOA's finances and practices, as well as a professional survey of the property boundaries in question. In the weeks that followed, the true extent of Victoria's manipulation was revealed. The audit uncovered years of selective enforcement, discriminatory practices, and financial irregularities. Victoria had indeed been working with Lakeview Properties to pressure certain homeowners to sell, receiving commissions on properties she helped acquire through HOA harassment. Walter had been aware of some improprieties but claimed he'd been coerced into cooperation through threats to expose his own financial difficulties. The property survey confirmed my grandfather's original boundaries, showing that approximately 20% of the clubhouse and 30% of the marina dock had been built on our land. Rather than demand their removal, I proposed a long-term lease arrangement where the HOA would pay a modest annual fee to my family's foundation, which would fund lake conservation efforts and restoration of historical properties around Pine Lake. Victoria eventually faced charges of breaking and entering, misappropriation of HOA funds, and ethics violations. She avoided jail time but received probation, community service, and was barred from serving on any HOA board or working in real estate development in the county. More painfully for someone of her status consciousness, she was forced to sell her lakefront home at a significant loss when her neighbors unanimously voted to remove her from the community she had terrorized. As for my grandfather's cabin, I preserved it exactly as he had maintained it for 70 years. Quirks, character, and all. The Historical Society designated it as a heritage property, protecting it permanently from future development pressures. I did make a few upgrades to the plumbing, electrical, and heating systems, though I kept the capability to activate my inconvenience traps should any future HOA tyrants come calling. Pine Lake is different now. The residents elected Harold Mackenzie as their new HOA president, operating under a completely revised charter that emphasizes preservation of the lake's natural beauty and historical character alongside reasonable maintenance standards. The Patels replanted their vegetable garden, which has become a community gathering spot where neighbors exchange produce and gardening tips. On summer evenings, I often sit on my grandfather's dock, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of amber and gold. Occasionally, Harold or the Patels join me, and we reminisce about the summer Victoria Jenkins learned that some legacies can't be bullied or bought, and that the most effective traps aren't the ones that cause harm, but those that reveal character. My grandfather would have enjoyed that lesson. After all, he's the one who taught me that patience, preparation, and principles are the most powerful tools anyone can possess. And somewhere, I like to think he's smiling at how his quirky old cabin finally served justice.